One difficulty many of us face is finding pleasure in prayer. But the mistake that we make is that we look for pleasure in prayer. And this is the reason why we face so much frustration. For example, if we imagine a time where we experienced pleasure in prayer, it was always after a difficulty, a hardship, going through the path of pain. For example, someone is facing a crisis where they're afraid that they might lose a loved one. Their life is in danger, they're sick, whatever the situation might be. And so they pray desperately, begging for the mercy of Allah Almighty. In that moment, all that matters is the mercy of Allah Almighty. If they're afraid of a personal loss, anything that it is, they just are praying out of fear of that loss, for either their prayer to be accepted or for some comfort to come from Allah Almighty, that Allah Almighty will be with them even through loss. So in that moment, when a person is in a state of crisis, it would be a disrespect to that prayer if he was thinking that, am I feeling pleasure right now or not? It would be a disrespect to that loved one for whom we are desperately begging for the mercy of Allah Almighty, that we're praying for them and they're in a crisis, and simultaneously we're asking ourselves in prayer that, am I feeling pleasure right now or not? When we completely break down and we realize that we have no strength and Allah Almighty is the source of all strength, then if we find the mercy of Allah Almighty through the acceptance of prayer or through some reassurance that Allah Almighty is with us or He will be with them, then that mercy is a pleasure in and of itself. The doors of the mercy of Allah Almighty are opened through sincerity, through submission, and through pain and struggle. So when a person truly and sincerely submits to Allah Almighty and prays to God Almighty with a heart filled with praise and with a heart filled with pain, then Allah Ta'ala is merciful towards that person. And finding that mercy is a pleasure in and of itself. A person doesn't have to ask himself or look for pleasure at all. So when it comes to prayer, our path towards pleasure is always through pain. After we've gone through that experience, a lot of times, then a person will come back to prayer and they'll only remember the pleasure that they felt. The reminiscence of that experience is just the conclusion and the climax that they experienced. So now they start looking for pleasure directly. They start observing Salat and they try to feel that pleasure again. But they don't realize that they can't feel that pleasure because that pleasure came through pain. So if they look directly for pleasure without going through the path of pain, then they find nothing but frustration. So this is one of the mistakes that we make. When we look for pleasure in prayer directly, there is no pleasure that comes directly from prayer. But in prayer, pleasure comes from going through the path of struggle and hardship and suffering. A similar experience applies to finding pleasure in the remembrance of Allah Almighty. When we forget about ourselves, when we remove ourselves, our fears, our likes, dislikes, everything, those things that we love, those things that we think are praiseworthy, when everything disappears through that mujahidah, and all that is left is Allah Almighty, then when we see His beauty and we are in awe of His presence, then a pleasure automatically results. So a person does not need to look for pleasure directly in the remembrance of Allah Almighty. A proper observance of zikr ilahi is a pleasure in and of itself. It is in fact improper for a person to observe zikr ilahi looking directly for pleasure or to ask himself, am I experiencing pleasure or not right now? For example, when a mother gives birth to her child, when she hears him or her cry, and when she sees them for the first time, then the joy of seeing that child is so great that it is a pleasure in and of itself. It is such a great pleasure that it even makes her forget whatever pain she is in. She doesn't ask herself in that experience that, am I feeling pleasure yet or not? Just to see that beauty is an experience in and of itself. So it would be a disrespect to the sentiments of motherhood in that moment to think that she would ask herself such a question. So similarly, when we ask ourselves that question, that I am remembering Allah Almighty, am I feeling pleasure yet or not? Then we are walking in the wrong direction. We are approaching it from the wrong way. And then rather than pleasure, we will most likely find nothing but frustration. Rather, we need to go down the path of struggle and pain first. Not looking for pleasure, but simply looking for Allah Almighty. The struggle and the suffering and the pain is in letting go of ourself, our lower self, our attachment to this world. And then making everything disappear. That is the path of struggle. And when everything else disappears, then when we see Allah Almighty, then that experience of seeing our beloved is a pleasure in and of itself. And there the question doesn't even arise that am I feeling pleasure or not? So here also looking for pleasure directly is a path to frustration. But looking for struggle, that will lead us inevitably to pleasure one way or the other. Our purpose in Salat is not to find pleasure. It is to find Allah Almighty. If the purpose of prayer was to find pleasure, it would be nothing more than a spiritual sport or a pastime. So when we find Allah Almighty, then that pleasure finds us. Our purpose in Salat is to find the mercy of Allah Almighty. When that mercy finds us, then pleasure will come on its own. It is the prostration and the Sajdah that we observe in prayer, which is a symbol of the solution to the mistake that we make of looking for pleasure. Because we keep on looking for pleasure directly, and Allah Ta'ala allows us to continue in that search until we completely tire ourselves out. And when we're frustrated and tired after our repeated failures, one after the other, then we have no choice but to fall before Allah Almighty, expressing our helplessness and saying that, "Oh Allah, I have no idea what I'm doing. I don't know how to observe Salat. I can't experience what I'm supposed to be experiencing here. I don't know." And that is a moment of complete submission. That is a sajdah, a true sajdah of prostration. Then, when we are able to let go of everything, let go of what we want, let go of this desire for pleasure or anything else, and just submit to Allah Almighty and be humble before Him and be insignificant before Him and put ourselves in His lap, then we find our Allah, and then pleasure finds us on its own. So it is an irony that our failure in finding pleasure is the only thing that can lead us towards actually finding that pleasure. So if we're looking directly for pleasure, and this is what we want, then the only way to get it is to utterly and miserably fail in that path. And then when we have accepted our complete failure and our utter helplessness, then the submission that results will bring with it that pleasure that we were looking for. But now it won't come from ourselves, it will come from Allah Almighty after our having let it go. And it will come back to us in a way better than what we had wanted in the first place. So the posture of Sajdah reminds us that it is in submission to Allah Almighty that all of our objectives will be achieved. And so long as we refuse to submit in our heart, and we want to do things our way, we want to do prayer and Salat our way, and we don't want to pray in the way Allah wants us to pray, but in the way that we want Allah Almighty to submit to us in prayer, then we will never be able to achieve what we want, and prayer will be nothing but frustration. But Sajdah teaches us that the path towards that pleasure that we think we want in Salat is from letting it go, and of prostrating and submitting ourselves entirely to Allah Almighty.